Now to tonight's guest, Michale Semple. He's the author of Reconciliation in Afghanistan. He spent most of his working life in Afghanistan on behalf of the United Nations and the European Union. He was there during the Taliban era and also under the Karzai regime. Michale Semple maintains extensive contacts on all sides of Afghanistan's fractious political divides, so much so that he recently secured an exclusive interview with a veteran of the Taliban movement, said to be one of the most senior surviving Taliban commanders and a confidant of the movement's leadership. Michale Semple is currently a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School working on conflict resolution, and he joins us live now from Dublin. Thanks so much for joining Lateline this evening.
Hello, how are you?
Now, this interview you conducted with this senior Taliban commander, did that conversation give you any comfort about the prospects of a political solution in Afghanistan?
Yes, definitely, because what I heard from this particular Taliban commander is something which I've heard from quite a few other members of the movement, which is that they're essentially war weary and they do not want to plunge Afghanistan into another round of civil war as international forces leave by 2014. Of course, that's not the end of the story. There are hawks as well.
So are they actually, though, open to negotiation?
What I would say is that inside the Taliban movement, there is an ongoing struggle, which we can sort of characterize as a struggle between the hawks and the doves. There are those who believe that they have a historic responsibility to avoid precipitating a civil war, and that means that they have to be involved in some kind of political process. And there are those who think that if they can make one more attempt to fight on as the foreign troops leave, they will be able to gain power again. And obviously the outcome of that struggle inside the movement will largely determine the future for Afghanistan.
Now, this particular fellow has said to you that in negotiations with America, they won't accept what they see as surrender and slavish bowing to the authority of the enemies. So what will they agree to?
I think it comes down to a matter of choreography, that what they will agree to is participating in an Afghan administration in which the other main political groups in the country are there. The Taliban are a member of that administration and not actually dominating it. And it's also quite clear from the discussions that they will agree to exclusion of Al-Qaeda and active measures to avoid Afghanistan being used for international terrorism.
Indeed, they say to you that Al-Qaeda is a plague sent down from the heavens. It's an extraordinary statement, especially coming from someone aligned to a group that's thought to have been so strongly attached to Al-Qaeda.
It's interesting, after so many years of the Afghanistan story, that there are really very different perceptions. This wasn't terribly surprising for either me or for other people who've listened to the Taliban over the years, but I know that I've talked to quite a few Western politicians who said this was the most remarkable thing that came out of my discussion and other people's feedback, which I find actually rather worrying, because it is clear to me that thinking responsible members of the Taliban movement, when they evaluated what happened to them in 2001 in the repercussions of 9/11, they concluded that the errors of their leadership in accepting the alliance with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda led directly to the US intervention and the toppling of their government. They realized that was a big mistake.
Now, you talk there about thinking and responsible elements of the Taliban, and of course we know there are other elements because there is an increasing number of Taliban attacks, 12 dead and 60 injured at a US military base just this week. What I found fascinating about your writing on this interview was that you said the Taliban has maintained a, quote, internal cohesiveness for approaching 2 decades. Now, there are you specifically talking about the strength of leadership or purpose, or both?
It's both, really. The Taliban have managed to pull off something which I don't think has had any precedent in certainly in the history of the country, which is that Mullah Omar, who became the leader of the movement in 1994 and is still the leader of the movement, despite the fact that very few people have seen him for the past couple of years, that he retains the loyalty of the bulk of the original commanders, and under the sort of the umbrella that is provided by his authority, they've got this command structure which extends throughout the country to every province and every district of the country, where, broadly speaking, the men who are there in the field fighting the insurgency accept the orders which are coming from above.
And you mentioned there that Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader, hasn't been seen for a couple of years. So are you convinced he is in fact alive?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Afghanistan is one of those wonderful places where there aren't really any secrets. It's possible to work out just about anything that's going on. He's definitely keeping a very low profile, but he's very much alive and active.
Now, he's raised questions to you, this particular fellow you've spoken to, has raised questions over what influence Hamid Karzai even has over the Afghan National Army and the local police. Clearly doesn't think that regime has much legitimacy. Are those people themselves, the police and the army, are they recognising the legitimacy of the government installed by Washington and its allies?
I think we are coming to the crux of the matter. What happens in Afghanistan doesn't only depend upon the Taliban, it also depends on how effective the government and its security forces are going into 2014 and beyond. There are real questions about is this an effective, credible, legitimate enough government that Afghans are prepared to sacrifice themselves in the service of that government and basically to prop it up. Because if Afghans reach the conclusion that this government isn't worth serving and isn't worth propping up, then the whole thing falls apart. Now, I think on balance, I think that as we go into 2014, Afghans are going to find that the government does actually survive the transition, the withdrawal of the international forces. But there certainly are going to be some very testing times along the way.
But of course, in Tokyo and in Chicago, more than 80 nations have vowed to continue supporting the Karzai regime, or whatever regime, whoever the leader might be, but that structure that has been put in place after that Bonn Agreement of 2001.
Yes, and you point there to a very interesting sort of fact of the roadmap for going ahead, which is that 2014 is not just the year in which the bulk of international military forces will withdraw. It's also scheduled to be election year, and it is the end of the tenure of the current president, Hamid Karzai. One factor that has helped retain a modicum of stability in Afghanistan despite everything over the past decade is that for those who are sort of signed on to the Bonn Agreement and the order centered around Kabul, there's only been one legitimate president. It's Hamid Karzai. Now he exits the stage over the next year and a half, and in principle there's meant to be a general election which will elect its successor. The reality is that in the kind of conditions we see inside Afghanistan today, holding a general election is going to be extremely difficult, and the kind of confusion, controversy, and frankly cheating that we had around the 2009 election, if that is repeated in 2014, it will immediately delegitimize whoever is the successor to Hamid Karzai. So in terms of working out what's the future and whether all those governments who signed on in Tokyo really have got sort of a viable government in Afghanistan to support, it depends on the handling of the political transition rather than just the military transition.
How do you rate the likelihood that Afghanistan will collapse back into civil war after the international forces significantly scale back towards the end of 2014?
I think that if there is a political deal with the Taliban, then they will manage to avert the threat of civil war. If there is no such deal, then I think that the civil war is really on the cards.
Now, just turning back to your interview with this Taliban commander, you don't name him, trying to protect his identity. But assumedly, Mullah Omar, the Taliban spiritual leader, wouldn't see any harm in getting the message out there, would he, that they're committed to fighting on regardless of the improbability of a military victory?
I think that Mullah Omar is having a great deal of difficulty running his movement, given what limited access he has. And I think that Mullah Omar has to contend with the fact that there is a sort of a hardline faction is present there in the leadership, involved in much of the day-to-day running of the movement. Mullah Omar was wont in the past to provide quite close guidance to the movement. He's left it sort of on autopilot for the moment. And I think one of the challenges as we pursue peace in Afghanistan over the coming months is that for all sides in the conflict, continuation of the war has become the sort of default mode. And there really is a challenge now, both for international forces being led by the Americans, for the government in Kabul, Hamid Karzai, and also for Mullah Omar and the Taliban to find a way of escaping from this default mode that war is the only way forward.
And yet the attacks continue. There also, from your interview, seems to have been a kind of softening of the rhetoric around the Taliban's social policies. But again, can the Taliban be trusted on that score, especially given the increasing threats to women in authority in Afghanistan? There seems to have been quite a record number of senior women being attacked and killed in Afghanistan.
Yes, absolutely. And I think on the conflict, I would say that the conflict is getting nastier, messier, bloodier, more intrusive the longer it goes on. So yes, there are threats to senior women, there are threats to all sorts of social categories. And I think this is something which the Taliban have to note as well, because when push comes to shove, in the decades to come, the people who have been involved in the Taliban struggle today will be answerable to their population for what they did in these years. On the issue of their social policy, I've had many discussions with the Taliban over the years. I think that they have realized that what they were trying to do in the 90s is simply non-viable. It was a mistake. If they get a share of power, in other words, if they're sort of, you can say, a junior member of a coalition, I don't think that they will stand in the way of things like broadening access to education, ensuring that girls can get educated. For me, one of the worrying things is that those in the Taliban who are still entertain illusions that they can actually recapture the country, they also try to use this as sort of part of their propaganda. So, I mean, for me, the real question is not, are the Taliban prepared to say nice things about education? The question is, are the Taliban prepared to accept a ceasefire? And for me, the debate really needs to move on now is, what are the conditions for all sides to move beyond war as a default mode and to accept a ceasefire, to accept that the fighting has to stop.
It seems some time off, though. Thanks so much for your time this evening.
Delighted to speak to you.